Okay, just show of hands. How many of you guys actually got a chance to take a look at the cleanup tool? Like really kind of look at it. There's a whole protocol for what I call on the ground usage of the tools. It was good to research all this stuff, but the truth of the matter is when you're modeling, you want to be able to get in, get out, and move on with what you're doing. And I think that's the most important thing when you're dealing with the idea of problem geometry. I want to give you something to work with so that moving forward you can actually implement the ability to keep your geometry squeaky clean while you're moving forward. Whether you use the settings I share with you in the exact order, that's up to you. I'm going to give you the ones that I use the most when it comes to setting up the cleanup tool. So basically, if you want to go to the cleanup tool, you're going to go to Mesh, you're going to go to Cleanup. Now, in general, I tend to set up my cleanup tool for finding issues. Now, there's some research that you guys ran into where some of the cleanup tool, like getting rid of lamina faces, you might be able to let Maya do that kind of work. But the truth of the matter is that I tend to be very suspect. So I tend to be the one to kind of go and find my issues and fix them myself. So the first thing I'll do is I'll make sure that I'm going to say select for matching polygons. I don't want Maya to do cleanup. I don't want Maya to tessellate for me. If I'm going to change my edge flow, it's going to be me that does it, not Maya does it. So that's the first thing I do when I set it up. Now, the other thing is notice that in the fix by tessellation part, I've unchecked four-sided faces. Why? Yeah, well, what are four-sided faces? That's right. It's the stuff that we like in our geometry. So unless there's a specific reason why you're hunting down quads, maybe to kind of invert a selection like you did in 3DF to find your bad geometry, I usually work with it off. And I'm usually working with it to find the bad stuff. I will check faces with more sides, more than four sides, concave faces. Faces with holes, notice I do not check non-planar faces. Now I'll go over that in a little bit. And then remove geometry, it's going to be lamina faces. I want to look for that. Non-manifold geometry. And then edges with zero length. And I kind of keep this to a low number. There's a reason. All right. It's a very, very low number. All right. So once I've got my cleanup tool set, so the protocol is this. And basically, I'll check geometry as I'm working. As you get more complexity out of a model, when you start attaching and merging complex shapes together, it's in those times that you're going to start creating the potential for problem geometry. So that's the first thing you got to realize is that anytime you make something more complicated, that's a good time to check it. When you're done modeling, maybe before you put in holding edges or use a bevel tool, you want to check your problem geometry just to see if you have any. And or when you're done with the model, completely done, and before you've multiplied it 50 times in your scene. Those are usually good checkpoints to go ahead. So here's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to kind of show you. Let's say on the far end of this, if I were to go ahead here and hit F, and you guys can do the same thing, if you want. Let's say I wanted to find faces on top of faces, which is another way of saying lamina faces. Okay? There's a lot of different strategies that an artist can use. But the first thing I do is like, okay, cool. I'm going to go ahead and apply the cleanup tool. And if I hit apply and something highlights, for example, here, we don't know what component selected, but it's highlighted in blue. And what the blue means is that it's active. One of the components triggered based on the criteria that we set in the cleanup tool, that sets something off. Now, we don't know what that thing is yet, but we know it definitely set something off. So there's a couple of ways we can go about doing it. Now, if it is faces on top of faces, one of the ways you can find whether or not you have faces on top of faces is you can turn on your face centers. For example, if I go over here to shift right click, polygon display, face centers. So what's wrong with what you see here. So if you see a situation where you have face centers and they're on an edge and you didn't put them there deliberately, you might have some faces on top of faces. Okay, a couple of other ways you can detect whether or not you have extra faces. If I hit the 3 key, suddenly one edge turns into 2. I'm like, well, where'd that come from? If you did not put it there yourself, question it. And notice in 3 key now, I'm actually seeing the face center full and center. So sometimes 3 key is a great way to check to see if you've got hidden geometry in places where you didn't expect it. So that's another strategy you can apply to what you're doing. Lastly, you can actually say, okay, let's say I don't have face centers on. Let's say I just go to vertex face. Well, notice there's these lines in between the faces. If this was fixed, I wouldn't have these lines in between with these face centers. So that means I have extra geometry as well. So you have 3 different ways to detect lamina faces. Now the fix, pretty simple. Does anybody have an idea how you would actually fix this? That's right. See, what happens is this. If we actually try to go ahead and let's say we did 3 key, let's just say we selected this, okay? Let's just say we selected these faces, okay? Now it doesn't look like anything happened, but guess what? I bet you if I tried to use the insert edge loop tool, not gonna work. That's because at that point, there's an actual microscopic gap between geometry. So deleting faces in this situation, not a good thing. The better solution is what we want to do is we want to go ahead and merge those verts out of existence. So what I'm going to have you guys do is go ahead, select the verts, shift right click, merge vertices. And once you do that, great. And then you can test it. This is what I do. My protocol is find the problem with the cleanup tool and then verify that you fixed it by running it again. If it does not highlight, if the tool does not highlight, you have done your job, just like that. Now, we're going to do the same thing here again. With this one, we're going to run the tool, hit apply. Now we get a face highlighting. So we actually have a component that's saying, okay, something's up here. So something pinged this, all right? So we're saying lamina faces, faces on top of it, faces. Well, something selected that. Well, what is the issue? Now, usually in this case, I'm like, well, I'm not sure exactly what highlighted. Is it all 6 faces or is it just one? So I'm going to go both sides. If I go like this, though, look at that. The whole face highlights. How did that happen? So in this case here, the fix is just deleting that back face and then running the tool to verify. Once it's done, you move on to the next. Okay? So that is an example of faces on top of faces. Now, finally, you guys have actually had some experience with this, cleaning up the bevel tool. Bevel tool creates problem geometry. As a matter of fact, look what happens when you select it. Anytime you get yellow highlighted verts, you're going to get, that is the signal for non-manifold geometry. It's a type of non-manifold geometry that's happening there. In addition, we got n-gons, we've got faces on top of faces, we've got a litany of things. So the fix, believe it or not, you guys have experience with already. And you are already learning how to clean this issue up by simply, and what's the move? What do we have to do with this? And then what else? And then, there you go. And then what else? That's right. And then go ahead, multi-cut tool, and then go boom, and then do. Okay? So the same thing here. So when you do this and you go through the motions of getting rid of this, you're effectively cleaning up the artifacts left by the bevel tool. Okay? And unfortunately, especially with 2 segmented bevels, there is a price to using them if you want to use them. So you got to be careful while you're using them to clean up any of these hard corners. So again, once you're done with your geometry, go right click, hit apply, If it doesn't highlight, that's music to a modeler's ears when it comes to the criteria that we're trying to check for. Hanging verts, let's move on. So basically hanging verts, guys, that's when you improperly delete stuff. So let's say I go and run the cleanup tool. 7 out of the 9 faces there are affected by n-gons. That's because someone hit the delete key on their keyboard rather than going through the trouble. So if you went that far, unfortunately, you're going to have to go manually delete those verts again. If I go select vertex mode and I select it, there they go. So again, this happens when you're in a rush, when you're not thinking about what you're doing. Take the time to do this. Now, remember the rule. When you're deleting verts, when you have 2 edges going into one vert, that makes it vulnerable. So you have to be careful. Sometimes people have the impression, well, if I just delete them, you know, it'll be fine. But if you get rid of your corners, you can get rid of them by accident simply because I've got one edge. This is a vulnerable vert, especially on flat topology. So it'd be tempting to go like that, but I lost my corners. So you're gonna have to be a little bit more strategic in the way you do this. So in this case here, I'd probably just go like this, hold down shift, and then delete that way. Then you want to verify it, hit apply, nothing highlights. There you go. Okay, concave faces. You guys did a lot of work on this. All right. So again, if I'm fine looking for concave faces, I'm going to go hit apply. There you go. So again, by definition, a concave face, the vert's pushed in onto the quad. All right. So it doesn't lend itself to good smoothing. That's fine. So we got a choice to make. Let's go ahead and either fix it. So I'm going to just bow this out. It doesn't take much. You can just do something like that, or like that. And again, depends on the goals of your edge flow. Now, if I go ahead here, hit apply, nothing highlights. So something is just a small adjustment is all it's needed. In this case, we just needed to move the verts so that they were away from that threshold. Okay. And again, you may decide, well, I don't know if I want that vert like that. Well, go ahead and hold down the V key, line it up. That's fine. You know, and do whatever you want there. So that's concave faces. Now, this non-planar faces is all about common sense, right? Does that little vert kind of going off in the distance look like that should be a deliberate modeling move that you make as an artist? Or does it look like you're reaching? Or does it look like a mistake? Okay, so there's a limit to what you can do with a quad that makes sense from what's going to happen with topology, what's going to happen with smoothing. And while you can probably get this to be justified in some way, honestly, there's no reason to. Now, here's the reason why I don't turn on non-planar faces. Because right now, if I go ahead and do it, it'll show itself. Watch what happens. I'll just turn it on just so you can see it. There it goes. It's going to show it. Now, if I were to fix it per the definition of non-planar faces, here's what happens. Boom. So let's say I've got perfectly planar quads. Run the tool. Nothing happens, right? Now, take a look at what happens when I just do this. Just that. Just that. Hit apply. Maya is telling me that's a non-planar face. So my question to you is this. Is there anything that looks wrong in the way that face is working, in your opinion? If you were modeling an organic character, what are the chances of some of these quads not bending just a little? Do you get what I'm talking about? That's why I don't work with this on. Because if not, here's what happens. When you leave this on, you're like, everything highlights sometimes, and while you're modeling, it's like, oh, what's wrong now? There's nothing wrong. You just set it to non-planar faces. So I deliberately turn that thing off. All right? Just because I apply common sense. All right? And I've seen quads bend even more, especially when you're kind of working with things like end cloth. That can happen pretty easy. So while it's not the best thing in the world for a quad, it's degrees of, and there's a common sense, and there's a point where it starts not to make sense anymore. Okay? So when cleaning up, fix on site, but don't put it on the cleanup tool. Not unless you absolutely are needing to have perfectly planar surfaces. There might be a gaming reason, a level building reason. There might be a reason why you're looking to kind of keep everything 90 degrees square and all your quads totally planar. But if there's no specific reason, no reason to look for it. It's like making problems when there aren't any. What else? Finally, faces with holes. Now, it takes a lot of effort to get to the point where you can make something this bad. But let's say you did, and I go ahead and select these pieces of geometry, hit apply. And the main thing is when I hit the 3 key, you're getting all sorts of weird rendering artifacts, not to mention just freaking out Maya. So this is the kind of thing you got to kind of decide to pick your battles on. So here's the other thing that happens when you try to use your tool sets. Let's say I wanted to use the multi-cut. Let's see, I'm just curious, would it work? No, not even close. It won't even, I mean, I'm going to try. Yeah, it did that, but it won't go to the line. Anything approaching this edge here, almost impossible to kind of get anything to happen. So you're better off just going ahead, deleting the whole thing, and then fill the hole. And then if you need to make a hole, make a proper hole. This one, you know, if you can't even get the fix, I mean, look, multi-cut tool. Let me see if I can even connect something to it. Let's see. Look at that. Even when I try to fix it, it's like, yeah, it's all sorts. You just gotta, this is a mercy killing. Let's get rid of it. Finally, what I call this um, the unholy trinity, non-manifold geometry. This is the stuff that can break rigs. This is the kind of stuff that can create pinching and dimples on your topology. This is the stuff that can screw up with tools. Non-manifold geometry is truly worth worrying about, and it's something that if you pass on upstream into your pipelines, they're going to think you're pretty much a novice. This is the part about caring about other people who work with you. So non-manifold geometry is worth caring about. One of the most common ones is this one, opposing face normals. And this happens when you're trying to create complex geometry, you know, and when you're trying to attach one object to another and don't even realize that your surface normals, when you're attaching things, are facing in different directions. So this is one of the examples of, let's say I wanted to try to use the bevel tool. Let's just say, I'm going to go over here, select here, 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 here. I'm going to go right click, bevel edge. It's like it didn't even register, all right? So what's the reason? Opposing normals, which is one of the reasons why I've got them turned on. So these normals are facing this way, and then look back here, these are facing out that way. So at the point where there's an issue, this is how Maya flags it. So if I go ahead apply, anytime that you have yellow highlighted verts, just assume you're dealing with non-manifold geometry of some type. And this is one of the first types. The most common flip normals on the same piece of geometry. So what is the fix? You can go ahead and do what we call conform. Conform basically just looks, it's a numbers game. If there are more faces face one way and there's the lesser amount going the other way, they tell the ones that are the smaller amount to get in line. So here's what happens now. And before you do this, I want to show you something else, because sometimes people kind of don't pick up on us. Look at when I hit 3 key. 3 key, at the point where the faces are opposing, we're getting the artifact of a crease. And there's no holding edge there. So when you get something like that, don't just like ignore it. Don't pretend like, you know, it's just Maya being Maya. You did something there. Definitely make the effort to figure out why and then fix it. Because if it's supposed to smooth properly, Here's what it's supposed to do. Let me go ahead and put conform on. That's proper smoothing. That's what it's supposed to look like. Let me go ahead and turn off the face normal so you can see what I'm talking about. Again, the protocol is once I fix the tool, hit apply, nothing happens. And then if you want proof that the bevel tool works, go to here, select the edges, and then miraculously shift right click, bevel edge, it works. So guys, when your tools don't work properly, when the insert edge loop tool dies off, maybe on an N-gon, don't assume it's probably because you created an issue. So this lecture and today's lecture is about taking responsibility for your topology so that you know what to do in the future when you run into problems. All right, here you go. Unconnected components. Now, I don't know too many people who work this way where they kind of just punch out holes and leave a vert attached like that. But right now, Maya doesn't like this kind of a connection. See that thing? That's just weird to Maya. It doesn't make sense from how things work. And by the way, do you guys know what the word non-manifold mean, right? Did you guys look that up? So if you look up the word manifold, if you had to boil it down, it's got the possibility of being able to be built as a real object in the world. All right. Non-manifold is the reverse of that. It's an object that would almost be impossible to make in the real world. And something like this, where it's kind of just being connected at one point, just like that, just Maya does not allow or like that kind of building to happen. And if you were to extrude these faces, you get weird connections like this. And that's another form of non-manifold geometry. And again, if I run the tool, there you go, some issues. So the main thing with this fix, guys, is do you even need that face there? That's the question. If you don't need it, get rid of it. Or if you do need that face there, then you can go ahead and select that and then go ahead and detach the component. So I would go over here to detach. And then if you want it as a separate piece of geometry, you can go to separate. And now it's two pieces of geometry. There goes one, there goes the other. I don't care how you fix it, but don't leave the attachment that way. Cool. Finally, the unmerged verts parts, this is sort of used to be easier in the old days. Prior to 2011, Maya changed its crease rules. I think I kind of mentioned this. In the old days, let me actually show you. I wonder if I can actually show you. It was easier to get to. There is what we call legacy smoothing. So if I go to the attribute editor and if I go to smooth mesh, let's see if this will actually kind of sharpen. Let's go over here. I'm going to go here and let's go to legacy. See what happens when we hit the 3 key. There you go. So prior to 2011, the boundary rules was that anything that was a vert, smooth. So if you had unmerged verts, that ugliness that you see there was really like plain as day. With the advent of the new smoothing rules, where basically the rule is if I have two edges going into a vert, do not smooth on a flat piece of topology. Now there's times when that's very, very practical and you need that and you don't always want to put holding edges on everything. This old way of working forced you to put holding edges on everything if you were working in 3-key smoothing. This way, well, you don't need as many holding edges to keep the corners, but what happens is that it hides the problems a little bit easier. So the only indication that you have an issue is what I call the swimmies. You see this guy? Now here's the irony about this. When we see the issue here, we think the issue is there. The issue is not in this area, it's up here. So when you run into this issue of unmerged verts and you can't detect them right away, it's never in the area where it shows you. It's always somewhere around it. So if you get the swimmies, that's the smaller, more subtler indication that you have unmerged verts in an area. The fix is the same as anything else back here. Take the verts, select them, merge them, and then hit the 3 key, and you should be able to get this working fine. And then if I run the tool, no issues. Okay. Finally, the last is the T formation. Again, a bunch of you had this right in your presentations. This is cool. There should be no reason why you should be building anything like this. I had a guy who built a scene. He was an online student, and they built their bookshelves just like this. Like literally, I was just, oh, I'll just pull it out with an edge. Now, again, I get it when you're a beginner modeler, you just try things. That's cool. But it is definitely not the way to build a bookshelf. All right. There's no thickness, there's nothing. And then look how this is what it does. So if I were to go ahead and turn this around, just like this, 3 key, what I tell you? Dimples. Now, I like dimples on my smiles, on my wife and my kids, but I don't like them on my topology if I didn't put them there. So something to keep in mind, this does not look good. Try to kind of avoid working this way. Again, the fix on this front is making a decision about these faces. In this case, I might just go ahead and say, do I need this? Or if I need this geometry, I'm going to extract it. And then I'll just make this bookcase properly. So if it has to be a bookcase, well, but if it doesn't need to be there, and usually what happens is this, people will extrude things by accident. If they're doing edge extrusion and you select the back of your model and you don't even know it, you can make this kind of geometry and don't even realize you have it in there. So it can happen to even seasoned professionals rushing. So you go ahead, check the geometry, hit apply, nothing highlights, you're good to go.